Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to the 76th Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, we've a lot to catch up on since bank holidays have taken their toll of Moggcasts recently. And I am going to ask you at some point about last week's events. But I thought I'd ask this question to start with. One of your colleagues was interviewed on television last night, a Brexiteer like you, and was asked about the economic benefits of Brexit. And this person said, "We'll come back in a year and I'll tell you." I wondered if you could offer us an answer in a quicker time frame.
Yes, indeed. The biggest Brexit economic benefit was that because of the early vaccine rollout, we were able to open our economy faster than any other European country. By economic scale, that is by far and away the biggest benefit that we've had so far.
Why couldn't David Davis think of that on television last night, rather than ask his interviewer to wait for a year?
I don't know. You'll have to ask David that particular question. He may, if I've read reports of that interview correctly, have had other things on his mind.
Such as?
I think people may want to watch catch up to view the interview. Perhaps I should too, because I haven't yet seen it.
You perhaps referred to his remark whereby he said that people were coming to him asking him to stand for the leadership.
I seem to remember you were an early backer of his. Indeed, I remember my father saying to me that because you were supporting David Davis, we should take his candidature very seriously. And I can't remember, and my father's a great admirer of yours, as I think you know, and he said to me, "Paul is a man of very good judgment. If he is backing David Davis, who my father never really knew, we should take this seriously." But I can't remember which election this was. It may have been 2001.
So the answer to my question is yes. In fact, before we take a brief detour down my personal history, I supported David Davis in 2001, became his PPS, and then supported him in the leadership election of 2005. But since this isn't yet the Goodman cast, it is the Moggcast, I think the answer to the question I was asking was that was what you were referring to. I'm bringing up the subject of Brexit because it's been rather topical recently for people to lay into the so-called or real lack of economic benefits of Brexit. What did you make of your colleague Tobias Ellwood's call for Britain to rejoin the single market?
Well, I think it first of all gave the game away for what some people want. And Michael Heseltine said words to the effect of "no Boris, no Brexit." So did Lord Danis. And there is a group of people who think that the only power behind Brexit is the Prime Minister. Whereas in fact, not only have I mentioned one big economic benefit, but the House of Lords has now had the second reading of the procurement bill, which takes 350 EU rules down to one rule. We will have the retained EU law bill, which will sunset all EU regulations, and that'll be coming in July. We have coming from the Treasury the billions of pounds every year that will be freed up by reforming Solvency II, by lifting restrictions on how insurance companies can invest, that could potentially give us the venture capital market that the West Coast of the United States has. I mean, we won't get there in one fell swoop, but it opens up this access to capital. Financial Services Bill also, which will incorporate this, making the UK financial sector as competitive as it was before the EU piled rules onto it post-2008 in the financial crisis. So there are really big opportunities, some of which have already been grasped, some of which are being grasped. And those who want to go back into the single market are really ones who wish we had never left the European Union in the first place.
Well, that's quite a list. Are you suggesting that the chairman of the Defence Select Committee, who's a well-known critic of the Prime Minister, might have scored a bit of an own goal by raising single market membership?
Well, an anonymous cabinet minister, who wasn't me, was quoted in the newspapers as saying that they wondered whether Tobias was secretly the Prime Minister's greatest supporter, because his comment was extremely useful in exposing the views of a certain section of society who have always resented the result. And that is a view within the British establishment. And there's a very good piece in The Sun today pointing out that this was the pro-European view of try and make life difficult for the Prime Minister and then stop Brexit or reverse Brexit.
Well, perhaps we'll have to do a Tobias cast to find out. And I want to just switch to a different set of questions before we come to last week's events. And just to ask a very general one to open this section, which is, have you, since becoming a minister, ever voted on a matter knowing that it would benefit your constituents?
Well, of course you vote on matters thinking it would benefit your constituents, it's one of the very interesting things about being an MP, isn't it? And you must have thought of this when you were an MP. We are not ambassadors representing different interests coming together and arguing. We are interested in the interest of the whole of the United Kingdom. But within that, we want that to help our constituents as much as anybody else's. We want the whole country to succeed, including our own constituencies.
And you presumably also voted on matters in order to further Conservative policy, have you not?
Well, I'm elected on the Conservative Manifesto. If you look at my voting record during the coalition years, I think every time I voted against the government policy, I was voting for the Conservative Party manifesto. I took the manifesto I was elected on reasonably seriously.
Can I controversially suggest, therefore, that you might inadvertently have broken the ministerial code, since the ministerial code Annex A quotes the 7 Nolan principles, and the very first one it says is selflessness. Holders of public office should take decisions solely in terms of the public interest, says the code.
I knew you were coming on to the code one way or another. No, I completely disagree, because I think that the interests of the country are set out in the Conservative Party manifesto. Otherwise, I'd stand on the Socialist manifesto.
You're basically saying that your constituency interest is also always the public interest.
There has never been a vote in my case where I have thought the constituency interest and the national interest have conflicted, but I can see those circumstances arising, and I don't think that contradicts Nolan either, because you can selflessly serve your constituents. It's a question of who are you being selfless towards. You're not selflessly advancing your own interest. You are advancing the interests of 70,000 people. And if the whole of North East Somerset were going to be concreted over for some reason, and this was of major economic benefit to the country, but massive disbenefit to my constituents, under Nolan, you are entitled to vote against it. Why? Because you are measuring a fraction of a boon to 60 million people or 70 million people against a very direct and massive loss to 70,000 people. And you have to make a judgment as to how that reasonably weighs up. So I don't think Nolan or the ministerial code contradicts acting in the interests of one's constituents. And where, not in legislation, but in campaigning terms, I have campaigned for things for constituents, and I think particularly of trying to get a very expensive drug for a child in my constituency suffering from Batten disease. I think looking after the interests of sick children is a national interest, a justifiable national interest, and against NHS budget of whatever it is, heading towards £180 billion, spending a certain amount on a child in my constituency is justifiable. So I think what Nolan means is that you shouldn't vote in the House of Commons to feather your own nest, and I agree with that. But of course you should be a champion for your constituency and for your individual constituents. Now that's the job of Member of Parliament.
First of all, you've just said what Nolan is really saying is you shouldn't vote to feather your own nest. That's explicitly laid out in the Code of Conduct for members, where the same words I've just used are applied again. But the words are added, they should not do so in order to gain financial or other material benefits for themselves, their family, or their friends. These words aren't in the ministerial code. Now, what you've just said may be right, it may be wrong, but it's virtue, insofar as it has virtue, which it does, is that you've said it. You've said I don't believe that Nolan could possibly mean.
I don't believe that.
There could be a clash between the public interest and the constituents' interest, as I've defined it. The question I'm going to work my way towards is actually who decides? Who decides? And since the Nolan Code was brought into effect, there has been the rise of the regulators. There's a Commissioner for Standards, there's an advisor on the Ministerial Code, Lord Geit. There's a Commissioner for Standards in Public Life, I think. And all these people are, if I was putting it in a negative way, encroaching on these codes and delivering verdicts. I mean, is it really satisfactory that you have codes that are written in that way, which are capable of genuine argumentation one way or another, that can be pronounced upon by people who we've not elected?
The Prime Minister decides and he is elected. This is fundamental. And that is why the Prime Minister has been entitled, and not just this Prime Minister, but previous ones, to keep ministers when the advisor, as with the Home Secretary, has thought that the code has been breached. I believe it was also done with Baroness Scotland by Tony Blair. It must be the Prime Minister, because people in the House of Lords particularly want appointments to the House of Lords to be taken away from the Prime Minister and made by unelected people. They think that makes the reputation of the House of Lords better and gets better quality people and so on and so forth. I think it's absolute nonsense. I think members of the House of Lords must be appointed by the Prime Minister because he has a democratic mandate to advise the Queen, which nobody else has. And we've moved, partly because of our membership of the European Union, partly because of the way people have felt about politicians, to a situation where we have handed more and more decision-making to unaccountable and unelected bodies. I think this is a mistake, and I think our departure from the European Union is allowing us to claw these things back for political and accountable decision-making. And you see that actually in the Health and Social Care Bill last year that brought back some powers to the Secretary of State for Health so that he can give more direction, because he is ultimately accountable for how the health service is run. And I think this is fundamental. I think the democratic mandate is what justifies government decision-making, and delegating it to people, however wise and good they are, without that mandate, does not lead to good government, but doesn't have the right authority to do it.
I think you've half said I've got a point, but I want to take you to the bit where you disagreed at the start, where you said you have an advisor on minister's interests and the Prime Minister ultimately makes a decision. Now, if the Prime Minister's robust, the Prime Minister will stand up to verdicts that might or might not be thought unreasonable. The question I want to ask is it right to put the Prime Minister in that situation in the first place? And is it always fair to ministers? I want to read you the exact words that the former advisor, Alex Aiken, wrote about Priti Patel. He wrote this: "Her approach on occasions has amounted to behaviour that can be described as bullying in terms of the impact felt by individuals. To that extent, her behaviour has been in breach of the ministerial code." So he never actually said Priti Patel bullied anyone, despite all the writing to that effect. He said that individuals could believe they had been bullied, but surely bullying is an objective fact. You're either bullying someone or not. It doesn't lie in the eye of the beholder, surely, does it?
You're obviously right, and the Prime Minister didn't accept that view, and the advisor resigned. I mean, I think that was all perfectly proper. The Ministerial Code is not a constitutional document. It is the Prime Minister's document, and if the Prime Minister sets it up to have an advisor, to give advice in certain areas, that is a decision of the Prime Minister. It has no legislative backing. It doesn't, to my mind, even have the backing of antiquity. It's been going for a few decades, but it's not a document you can find traces back to even the Victorian era, let alone to 1688-9. So it's not part of the inner wiring of our Constitution. It is a prime ministerial document that the Prime Minister is the ultimate judge of, subject, of course, to the voters. And that's as it should be.
Talking of which brings me to last week. Now, I could put to you the case that the Prime Minister's likely to face another confidence vote in the autumn. You could put to me the case that everything from here will be sailing towards the sunlit uplands, and the question or discussion would go round and round. I want to ask you instead why you thought that 141 of the colleagues, 2/5 of the parliamentary party, had voted against him.
It's always difficult to know precisely why people vote in a particular way, and there will be mixed motives from various people, and that there will be those who have never really accepted the Brexit settlement, who never wanted it. There will be those who would like a different tone of the Conservative Party. But I would say that every leader has always faced a reasonable number of people who are not fully supportive of the leadership. So I don't think one should necessarily be very surprised by this.
Are you able to tell me what the total number of the payroll vote is? If I include in the payroll vote, I mean, you might argue about the definition, not only PPSs, but party vice chairman and deputy chairman and ambassadors and the like.
I think you've come up with a figure, haven't you? 100. But I'm not authenticating your figure, but you've come up with a figure, and subscribers.
Well, I haven't come up with it. For the Institute for, bless its cotton socks, Institute for Government came up with a figure. It said between 160 and 170. So I've gone for 165.
Right.
All right. But you don't know.
But be perfectly honest, I don't think when it comes to vote of confidence, the payroll matters. I don't think you will find that the payroll voting in secret all take as higher-minded view as you might wish that they would.
Well, I wanted to probe that a bit, because just assuming for a moment all, let's call it 165 members of the payroll voted for the Prime Minister last week, that would mean that only 46 backbenchers did, which is distinctly a minority of the 195 or so. But you don't think that happened? You think some members of the payroll didn't vote for the Prime Minister?
Well, I don't know how people voted, but I think it's very unlikely that only 46 backbenchers voted for the Prime Minister. In a secret vote, people will vote freely, obviously, won't they? I mean, that's the point of having a ballot.
I kept churning the figures around and tried to work out how many members of the payroll would not have voted for the Prime Minister if a majority of the backbenchers did, and I came up with something like 52. Irrespective of the actual figure, do you think it's incumbent on people who are on the payroll, particularly ministers and PPSs, who've been appointed by the Prime Minister after all, and therefore owe him their loyalty, do you think it's incumbent on them to vote for him and to say that they voted for him?
Look, I think this is getting into very difficult territory, that if we demanded that it was an open vote, it would be very different, but it's not an open vote. And therefore people are free to vote in the way that they see fit. And I don't know how many members of the payroll voted against the Prime Minister, but of course I assume that some must have done. I think it would be unrealistic to think that not one of the 160 to 170 figure that you're quoting, 165 midpoint, were loyal to the Prime Minister. Bear in mind, Prime Ministers, when creating governments, always have to be aware of balancing the party as a whole, and that our political parties in the system we have are always coalitions of views anyway. And a successful Prime Minister inevitably and invariably needs to balance those views.
He shouldn't, therefore, in your view, fire people who are known not to have voted for him, or who won't confirm that they haven't voted for him, but who were on the payroll.
Look, anyone who has publicly come out and said that he should not be Prime Minister has quite rightly resigned from the position that they hold, that if you move into public opposition to the Prime Minister, you cannot maintain a governmental role. However far it is from ministerial office. On the other hand, you can assume, post the vote, that anyone who is still in office supports the Prime Minister.
But it's perfectly illicit, in your view, for a minister to say, I'm not telling you whether I voted for the Prime Minister or not, and for the Prime Minister to keep them in office.
The Prime Minister is entitled to establish the ministers that he wants and to advise the Queen accordingly. And he may take the advice of Elizabeth I and not like to make windows into men's souls.
Let me just finish with a quick general question then. I've deliberately not really allowed you the space so far to persuade the listeners that the government can now move from last week's events towards the sunlit uplands. So this is your chance now to persuade them that it can.
Thank you. I think it's absolutely essential that we support the Prime Minister who got a mandate from the British people. I think there is a real problem with MPs ejecting a Prime Minister who has that mandate. Theresa May didn't have that mandate. She basically lost an election. Margaret Thatcher did have that mandate. And the Tory party in the ensuing years did nothing but argue with itself. And therefore there is the very high risk of internal dissent being very bad news for the Conservative Party. But also, if you look at where we now are, the Prime Minister, and I know you've heard me say this before, has got the big decisions right. He'd managed to deliver Brexit. He managed to deal with COVID in a way that respected freedom as far as possible, got the vaccine sorted out, got the economy open sooner than other countries, recognised at Christmas that we should remain open when everyone was telling him he should close down, and was instrumental in supporting the economic schemes that meant we still have an economy to come back to. Now, there may be inflation, but if we hadn't had the 408 billion of support schemes, the inflation would have been much worse because every aspect of the economy would have closed down and there would be no restaurants open. Most shops would have closed. And the quote, non-essential, unquote, shops would have gone out of business. They couldn't have survived for so long. So the structure of the economy maintained, the balance being struck. I was always, as you know, on the side of greater freedom. But I think the Prime Minister got the balance right, considering the responsibilities he had. He has got the judgments on Ukraine right and led the Western world. And now, at last, 2.5 years from the last election, we are able to get on with the legislative programme that we would have liked 2 years ago. And this is the bills I've already mentioned on the benefits of having left the European Union, the Levelling Up bill that Michael Gove introduced last week, that finally we are able to get on with what Conservatives should be getting on with. And it's the Prime Minister who's leading that. I'll tell you from my own experience in the bits I am doing on Brexit, there is a lot of teeth sucking about doing things that repeal EU rules and things like that. And there are lots of officials would prefer that things stayed as they are. Who is always supporting me? Who is always egging me on to take all the opportunities? The Prime Minister. So from the point of view, do we actually get things done? Do we have drive and energy? It is the PM who we need. So I remain completely supportive of him. And I think that people who want to see Conservative governments continue should support him too.
Jacob, thank you very much. And fortunately, I don't think we have any more bank holidays planned before the summer recess, so I'm looking forward to seeing you in a fortnight.
Thank you very much. Oh, and should we, before we finish, congratulate the Queen, who today became the second longest serving monarch in recorded history, taking over from the late King of Thailand, and she has just under 2 years to go to beat Louis XIV.
Dear reader, this is a public service announcement when Jacob says today. What he actually means is yesterday, by the time you're listening to this broadcast, which is a point I always like to make, just to make sure everyone's up to date. Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.